not based on interdependence, not based on the elites being sort of intermixed, but based on essentially mutual fear, because technologically they were equal and consequently neither side had anything to gain from war.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast, a production of Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm your host, Adam Dixon. Today I'm joined by Branko Milanovic, a professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York and a noted scholar of inequality. He served as lead economist in the World Bank's research department for almost 20 years, leaving to write his book on global income inequality, Worlds Apart, which was published in 2005. Since then, he's published many other notable books, such as The Haves and the Have-Nots, Global Inequality, Capitalism Alone, and most recently, Visions of Inequality, From the French Revolution to the End of the Cold War. Branko Milanovic, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. It's of course a pleasure for me to be talking to you, and secondly to be in such a beautiful place, which was Adam Smith's home.
Yes, I should tell listeners that we are sitting here in Panmure House, just off the Canongate in Edinburgh, at Adam Smith's last home that he lived in from 1778 to 1790. And we're sitting in the room that we believe was his study, where he made major revisions to his most famous book, The Wealth of Nations, but his equally very important, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So we're not sitting in a room that's just, we're not sitting in some studio, we're sitting in a room that has a lot of, I would say, gravitas, if that's a word,
right,
for anyone that's interested in classical political economy.
We can feel a little bit.
We can feel, so we're going to try to channel some Adam Smith.
Energy.
Because indeed in your new book, as we'll discuss later on, Adam Smith has an important part. But before we talk about your book and what influenced you, who is Branko Milanovic? I mean, you have a fairly well-known profile in at least economic circles and those working on inequality and development economics. But I'm sure not all listeners will know your story. What makes you tick? Where do you come from? What's the Branko Milanovic story?
You know, Adam, of course, it is a very good question. And people ask me because, you know, the question is actually, how did you get interested in the topic of income distribution? And as you know, I've been interested in that for many years. You mentioned, actually, I worked for 20 years at the World Bank. I studied before that. And I became interested in the topic of income distribution when I was still in university studies in college in Belgrade, in Serbia, which was then Yugoslavia. And I got interested, first because I was interested in social questions, but because I studied statistics. And when you study, particularly I think in Eastern Europe, you study many technical things without much relationship to the real world. In other words, you do the distributions, you do the parameters, you do the properties of distributions, but you have no idea where to apply them. That was generally a problem, the sort of disconnect between the applied stuff, research, and essentially theoretical stuff. And then when I first time saw that all this income distribution, all this distribution that we studied, normal, log normal, chi-square, students distribution, they could be linked to a real social phenomenon like income distribution. I just became totally fascinated by that and actually started studying and looking at the Lorenz curve, Gini coefficient, and so on. So to cut a long story, I think it was a combination of two interests. One, in social issues, and secondly, statistics, when you can see how your interest in social issues can be expressed numerically in something that you're studying. So that was really the connection.
What's interesting, though, is that you mentioned you became interested in the income distribution, though, while you were living in socialist Yugoslavia, where you would think, is there an income distribution in a socialist country of the time? And so you can imagine if you're in a capitalist country, we take as kind of given that there's inequality and there's a wide income distribution. But I'm curious, how did you become interested in that in the political economic context that you were at the time? And how did that
Yeah.
shape your thinking?
It's a good question. No, there are several sort of angles that one can look. First, Yugoslavia was a market economy, socialist market economy. So that's the difference. So inequalities did exist. Secondly, there was a strand of literature, sociological literature, that claimed that socialist societies, and that's actually in my book, were really class-based societies in the sense that they didn't have capitalist class, but they had a new class, which was sort of distinct group of people who had, of course, difference in political power and then consequently represented a class. Now, whether it is a good theory, bad theory, there are many issues with that, but that strand of thought existed. And the third, which is actually Yugoslav specificity, is a country which, that's why it broke up eventually, as a country with large inequalities between the republics.
Right.
I mean, if you take the most developed Slovenia, which is up north, and the least developed province, which was Kosovo, the gap was 7-1, which is an enormous gap. As I say, it is having Spain and El Salvador in the same country.
Right.
So that difference was very present and was studied quite a lot.
Okay.
But the difference between different groups of people was studied much less, and it was not, as you actually implied, it was not a topic that was encouraged, let's put it like that. So the data did exist, very few people studied it, and when it was studied, it was more like issue of social transfers, how child benefits benefit, mothers of, parents or whatever. But the reason why I said I got interested was really this rather class element, much more than the inter-republican inequality.
In that interest, I'm curious what was the canon of economics or political economy that was encouraged or at least shaped that, right? So you can imagine, like you mentioned, where there was class, there was difference, but from what I take, it was, yes, this exists, but let's not talk about this out in the open because that undermines the kind of political agenda that we have. And so I'm curious what kind of canon elements, if you like, what thinkers, what ideas were encouraged or allowed, and then I would say a second question to that is then how did your thinking change over time as you grew as a scholar and an economist?
No, it was exactly as you said, actually. The topic existed, as I said, the data also existed, not microdata, they were not released, but at least tabulations. But it was not an encouraged topic. And the reason was as follows. Essentially, I'm telling you from sort of purely ideological part of the, let's suppose, the party people or the ideologues or whatever. We have a socialist society. The socialist society has abolished classes because we don't have capitalists. And it's a fact, we didn't have capitalists. They're a small, obviously, landholders and so on, but these are by definition not capitalists. They don't hire labor, and this is not really very important in terms of GDP. So then the theory was, why worry about income inequalities between different categories of people? Because essentially whatever inequality does exist is the right inequality. Because people are paid differently. Those who work more get paid more. Those who study more, they are more skilled, they contribute more to society, they should pay more. So let's not really open this, not can of worms, but let's not open this topic, because essentially the situation, the things are as they should be. This is a little bit, I would say, my interpretation of this ideological reluctance to open up the issue. As I said, one should not exaggerate. The issue was discussed in the papers. It was present, but it was present as highlighting the deformations or something which was unfair within the system, but it was never questioning the fundamentals.
Right.
So that's the difference, and I think actually that difference still exists. For example, people look at China. China has enormous number of articles which question that, but they don't question the fundamentals.
Right.
And they actually didn't question in the West the fundamentals until the I would say generally until the economic crisis of 2008. So yeah, I think there are some similarities there.
Right. So then going to the question of, in your book, I mean, we're sitting here at Adam Smith's house, and what's great about your new book is that for people interested in income inequality or in the income distribution, there's a lot of rich discussion there, but it's also a nice text as an economic history of the history of ideas, and so I'm just curious, how does classical political economy fit with income distribution, or the study of income distribution?
I became, for example, first I have to say that actually the authors who are discussed in the book, and they start with, as you mentioned before, before the French Revolution, with Francois Quesnay, and then go through Adam Smith, the usual sort of succession of Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marx, then continue with Pareto, that's of course specific of income distribution, and then Simon Kuznets, were the authors whom I have read for many years. For Pareto and Kuznets, that's kind of obvious. Marx, as I mentioned even before, actually, I read it when I was at the first at the college, and actually even in high school. Adam Smith later, I think I was probably 25. It was after I graduated after I got my bachelor's. Ricardo was a difficult author and still remains. That it's very hard, I think, to read the principles in a single go. You can read one chapter here, another chapter there, because it's an extremely demanding book, and it's a very abstract book. And I find it, although it is a short book, but reading the whole book at once, unlike Smith, which is actually readable at once. Ricardo, I find actually it's very hard to sit down and say, okay, I'm going to spend next 2 weeks just reading all the chapters. You rather read some chapters and then go to the other ones. And then, as I mentioned, of course, I've been sort of familiar with him. Then at some point, and I found a note that I wrote to myself in 2014, I actually had the idea to say, okay, how about putting them all together and studying one aspect, which was income distribution. And when I did it, was essentially during the COVID time. I had more time. I was at home, like many of us, rereading these books and ordering through Amazon other books that I have to say actually are now much more easily accessible than they used to be. And particularly for the authors like Adam Smith, it was, copyright has expired and you can actually get whatever you want. And so that was really the time when I did it. But the idea was there before, and this was just made it possible for me to have like 2 years with practically very few interruptions.
And so then how, you mentioned Pareto and Kuznets as being already fundamental to how you understood income distribution as a contemporary matter of economics. Where were the classical political economists? Where was Smith, Marx? Where were Smith and Marx and Ricardo, and for that matter, Quesnay, before you decided to go on this project? So they were there somewhere, but I mean, how were they there before you actually sat down and think, oh, there's actually something useful with them? Or
no, they were a little bit in my head, and Marx was actually a little bit more even in my teaching. But not Smith, because when I would teach, and I've taught that class, 2 versions of that same class, probably for more than 12 years approximately, maybe even more actually. And I would start with methodological stuff about income distribution. I would start with the definitions, what is income, what is wealth, what is consumption, how it is measured, and so on. And then I would go directly, I think, after methodological introductions that would actually include Gini, for example, or Lorenz or Dalton, I would go straight to Pareto, because to some extent Pareto was the first to use the modern approach in the sense that we look at individuals, not at classes. But as I was saying before, when I had this idea of a project, I was by necessity pushed in a different direction because Smith, Ricardo, Marx speak of class inequalities.
Yeah.
So we have really what is called today functional inequality, not interpersonal inequality. So to go straight to your question, they were there, especially Marx, in my mind, but I was not teaching them because the teaching in my class originally started really from interpersonal inequality, and then you basically start with Pareto.
Right. So then what about the classical political economists like Smith, Ricardo, and Marx is useful for understanding the income distribution today, right? So it's the difference. So they talk about class, and that's a word that is, we talk about class much more, kind of went out of the lexicon, and now in the last 10 years, people think, oh, wait, class actually matters. I mean, is that why they're relevant for readers in in 2024, or what makes them useful?
I think there are two things which make it useful. First of all, simply studying how historically our interest, meaning the interest of the most important economists, has evolved over 2 centuries, gives us indirectly an impression of how our own interest now and in future would be shaped by the circumstances that exist. In other words, if we see that it went from interest in legally defined social classes like under Keynes to the classes that are defined by their relationship to the means of production like in Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, to Pareto, as I said, interpersonal inequality, to Kuznets, where inequality is really a phenomenon between urban and rural areas, to today's phenomena where we actually have race and gender much more at the focus of our attention than either of the 6, none of the 6 had. And that actually makes you sort of think how it would be, how our perception, what is the key cleavage, is really influenced by our reality and how it could be in the future. So that's one. But there is a second one. I think there is a little bit, as you said, there is a little bit over not a little bit, more than a little bit, of a return of class and the return of the elite. The class is coming back because of the importance of capital incomes, because of their concentration, and because I think also of the artificial intelligence that would actually increase the capital share.
Right.
And elite has come back in a different form through basically top 1%. So I would say that Marx, Ricardo, and Smith, through the class part, are back, and Pareto, through his insistence on the elite, is also back.
Right. Because in the case of Kuznets, as you mentioned, he was looking at the American experience effectively, right? And that urban and rural differences, and the kind of 20th century. I mean, there was still that expansion, and how do we understand the kind of American growth experience? Whereas now, class is back because.
But I'm actually always I was always very favorably exposed to Kuznets because in my global inequality, I interpret his inverted U-shape to have been driven, in the case that he observed, and in the case that we observe now, to have been driven by technological revolutions. He didn't formulate it like that because he observed one instance. And he believed that that one instance would push inequality up. Take, like, for example, South Korea. That was generally kind of applied. Okay, so there will be an increase in inequality during the economic expansion. Then there will be autonomous forces that would basically curb the further increase. There will be more capital, so that the return to capital won't go down. Population would age, so there will be greater demand for social spending because the country would be richer, and so on. But you can apply the same reasoning that he had then to the technological revolution now. And I think that you can actually argue, that's what I argue in my book, that you can even sort of bring Kuznets back by arguing that he saw one wave, but the same reason could be sort of extended to another wave of technological revolution. So that's why I would say that Kuznets, in my opinion, and particularly now when you see, for example, some of these countries like the UK was recently, or Israel also, going with very high inequality and then a reduction. You do actually see kind of a Kuznets-like movement there as well.
So I'm I'm curious what, some listeners might be wondering, they keep hearing Karl Marx being mentioned in the context of David Ricardo and Adam Smith, and they might be thinking, well, what do they have in common? Because isn't Adam Smith supposed to be the father of capitalism? And how is he related to Karl Marx? And wouldn't they have very different views on inequality?
I actually don't think that they would have very different views, but let's look at the connection. Connection, I think, is very straightforward from Marx, because Marx saw Adam Smith and especially Ricardo as definitely precursors. As Schumpeter says, there is only one economist who can be considered to be Marx's master or teacher, and that's Ricardo.
David Ricardo, correct.
And obviously Ricardo is intimately related to Adam Smith, because Ricardo got interested in the questions of political economy by making notes on his vacation on the wealth of nations. So the connection, I think, is very strong. It's classical political economy. It is three classes. That's all three authors share that. Three classes, distinct classes with distinct incomes that are received for distinct reasons.
And so so listeners know what you mean, those three classes is workers, merchants, or capitalists,
and
landowners.
And then basically one is return to land, another one is return to the ownership of capital, and the third one is the return to labor. So it's very clear all three of them work. This is really sort of their fundamental material with which they work. And this is the similarity. Now, there is another similarity between Marx and Smith. It is the stadial theory of development. It was, of course, developed originally by Smith and by actually Scottish Enlightenment,
correct,
Hutchison and others. And then, of course, was taken over directly by Marx and extended. No, the difference, and actually I might even talk about that today, was in Smith's view, there is no further extensions, at least he doesn't mention them. A commercial society is to some extent the end of the evolution.
It's the end.
It's the end. Yes. He doesn't say that explicitly, but he doesn't say about anything else.
Right.
Now, Marx takes all of that more or less unchanged, because if you read Smith, feudal society is there. He calls allodial society on before. There is, of course, primitive societies of shepherds and agriculturalists. So it's all the same as in Marx. Now, Marx takes one step further and says, okay, after the commercial or so-called capitalist society, we'll have another one.
Right.
So that's the difference. But, technically, both of them see the evolution of society as being progressive from less developed, less complex, without division of labor, to much more complex with division of labor and more advanced.
Well, that's, I think, the difference between Marx and his Hegelian perspective versus the Scots and the Scottish Enlightenment was the Scots, where they weren't speculative. They were kind of working backwards and say, they observed in history this particular development. Marx takes that empirical view, but then projects it and speculates on a potential future, whereas the likes of Adam Smith were much more guarded in being prescriptive on this is where the direction that they were going. And I think if you read Smith and even other Scottish Enlightenment scholars, there's almost a sense of surprise that we got to where we are, considering how history has been quite violent and oppressive, and in a commercial society, yes, it was still not necessarily great for many people, but it was still that sense of a much more diversification of the economy, much more freedom for at least some individuals to pursue different activities, and that was unique in history. But they didn't take that to the next step and see where they're going in terms of where's the logical extension, where Marx does.
That's actually really an interesting issue, and I have to say that particularly in the connection to the Visions of Inequality. Of course, I've read quite a lot of Marx, but I have not read Hegel. And it is, I understand, and I'm maybe too old to read Hegel, but it is a little bit of a problem. because this last extension would not have happened without Marx being a student, actually not literally because Hegel already died, but being influenced by young Hegelians and neo-Hegelians in Berlin. So I think that step that he took is a very natural step that, of course, others have also taken, but it is not. It is due probably to German philosophy and to that sort of attempt to think forward. Now, I have to say, and we had a little bit of a conversation about that before, it is very difficult because now when we are now in present time and we are seeing the developments of what we call state capitalism, we see liberal capitalism, we have a contrast between democracies, what is called democracies and autocracies. And you ask people, okay, so what will happen next? It's very difficult to say that. And I'm not talking about what will happen next week, but I'm talking what will happen in the next 50 years. And we have to basically try to go back to the authors that you mentioned and to say, how did they solve that conundrum? Because the problem was the same at that time. And what can we say about the future? And then you realize it's really not easy at all. You can be entirely wrong.
Right. I mean, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine the other day, and he said, you know, when we're old and retired, I don't think democracy is going to exist anymore globally. I mean, I heard that and I thought, wow, that's really pessimistic. But when you look at democratization around the world, it's in decline, and it's in going backwards. I tend to be a bit more bullish on democracy because I think fortunately, we still have some healthy democracies, and democracy is better than other forms of government. But again, I don't know where we're going, and I think it's hard to speculate. But we do have some big questions. And you mentioned earlier artificial intelligence, and that is, that's become the zeitgeist. And if we overlay artificial intelligence now on, as you mentioned earlier, already having a 1%, already having a premium paid for skills, where unskilled are not getting any of the gains of globalization, not getting any of the gains of economic growth. Is it okay for us to speculate? And I mean, or what does Branko Milanovic think the next 20 years is going to be there? And how does artificial intelligence, how do you think that's going to play out with inequality and how we understand inequality in the income distribution?
Yes, that's actually, I thought of this only more recently. But let me, before I answer that question, Adam, if I may, let me just go back, because we are now in Adam Smith's room, and address this issue about the future, because Adam Smith's writing is very dynamic in the sense that the time plays a role, where he has all this description of the earlier societies and moves them to the basically commercial society of Scotland of his day. It's very dynamic. But when I was actually reading his critiques of many of the features that he's critical, whether it be government, employers associations, organized church, and so on, it seemed to me, and that's actually not in his book, but his interpretation, that there is in the background a sort of quote unquote an ideal of a commercial society, which would be a society where all incomes would be obtained only through service to somebody else, sale of goods or services, and with what we can call free competition. So that was, it seems to me, a background ideal that he had, which you might say it's different, obviously, from Marx, but it's still an ideal which enables him to criticize actual commercial society of the time. Because without that background, it's very hard to criticize unless you have some sort of a template of a desirable society.
Right. So his system of natural liberty,
exactly,
which some have taken as the Adam Smith model that he suggests is possible, where actually, at least my reading of the system of natural liberty is that this is let's take this as a thought experiment almost of what would natural liberty look
Absolutely.
like, and from that you can critique the actual existing experience and look at different institutions and how they're functioning
Absolutely.
and who's holding the power. But he doesn't offer the system of natural liberty, at least my reading of it, as something that is necessarily achievable or that we should
Absolutely.
necessarily strive for. I mean, he was actually more conservative in that, whereas Marx was much more politically active and had, there was something to strive for that he expected to happen, was I don't think Smith ever expected. But like you said, that system of natural liberty was allowed him to critique. So then, let's fast forward to the future. Then how can we take Smith to think about perhaps artificial intelligence and the income distribution and how we reward economic activity?
I was not until recently too, how should I say, worried about artificial intelligence, because I thought this is a phenomenon that we have known, and going back to Ricardo, we have known through the history. Ricardo, of course, has this famous chapter on machinery that everybody mentions, where actually machines replace labor, and then the question becomes how it would affect labor and whether it will be temporary change or it will be longer term change. And to some extent, yes, artificial intelligence is very similar. It would have similar effect. However, the difference, of course, that's what we start realizing now, is that would actually cut into much more skilled labor force than we got used to. We got used to essentially labor, and it's present in Adam Smith. Machinery substituting for labor. It leads to sort of what Marx called de-skilling of labor, because essentially you need really people who do one or two tasks, and that was really division of labor also in Adam Smith. Right. But now we have machines, or actual artificial intelligence is also the same type of machine, which replaces labor that in the past we believe was to some extent irreplaceable or would not be replaced. And that does make, there is a jump there, because that actually potentially replace significant chunks of very highly skilled labor. And then the issue becomes, these highly skilled laborers have been trained through history and through the years to fulfill certain tasks that they believed, and there are quite a few of them, that they believe will be there. But these tasks would be now fulfilled much more simply, or equally perhaps, by cheaper means of artificial intelligence. So it does pose a fundamental issue, what these people would do. And then from income distribution side, it actually implies increased share of capital, simply because the artificial intelligence, like every machinery, is owned by people who actually own the companies that produce these things. And that increased share of capital is problematic from the point of view of inequality, because capital is still very heavily concentrated among the top. And then you have a quasi-automatic increase in income inequality. So that's where the problem of artificial intelligence, from my point of view, comes.
And then, which poses a challenge for governments, in that
Absolutely.
how do you tax it, and then how do you continue a system of transfers to address those inequalities, or address the outcomes of those inequalities from a social cohesion perspective. So what do you think? I mean, I guess the question then is, what are these masses of skilled workers going to do? What is the state going to do?
I think it is difficult, and I'm not really an expert on the labor part, but I think that there will be issue with lots of employments, lots of jobs that, as I said before, people have studied and sort of taken them to last them throughout their life cycle, and they will not. So there will be this, I think, issue. Right. And there will be also the issue, as I mentioned before, of the increasing capital share. Now, technically, the capital share problem can be solved, I think, in two different ways. One, either you tax capital, so that actually you take quite a lot of money from these people who would actually make a greater income through profits, and then you use that for social services, social assistance, maybe even to compensate the losers on the labor side. And the second possibility, which is a harder possibility, but I think in the longer term is better, is to try to redistribute capital to the extent possible, which means to give advantages both to the small investors who actually are very reluctant to go in the stock market because obviously if they lose, if people have like €3,000 of dollars and they lose that, they don't want to lose that.
Right.
You have to protect them somehow. Or differently, you can also link wages to shareholding, basically workers' shareholding.
Mm-hmm.
So in both of these ways would broaden the ownership of capital, and consequently the greater capital share would have less of an impact on overall inequality.
Because we all become capitalists.
Because actually, I mean, yes, essentially, put it to the extreme, which then is very easy and understandable, is we all become capitalists, and then actually, technically, if capital share was very equally distributed, there would be nothing wrong with increasing capital share.
Right, but even in most rich countries, stock market ownership, either as a retail matter or through people's pension funds, tends to be, in some countries at least, it only touches 50% of the population.
Yes,
and
yes.
And there's still large swathes of the population that don't own stocks, don't own capital, have very little invested. I know there's, efforts to kind of democratize finance, but that hasn't really taken off like you would expect it to.
No.
And so I'm just wondering, if that's a solution. If that is that.
It is this is not a new idea. People have had this idea for a while. It has not worked very well because it was, I think, applied half-heartedly. You could actually have, and there are people who have proposed, for example, having special tax advantages for the companies that involve workers in shareholding, for example. So there will be greater incentive. I mean, it is really somewhat paradoxical that we pay in shares, we pay people who are at the top, so they become, other than managers, they become also shareholders, and we don't pay workers.
Right.
So I think there are ways to do that. I'm not. I don't think it's panacea. I think it's hard, but I think if you combine that attempt to broaden the ownership with possibly higher taxation of what used to be called unearned income, which was income from property, you could actually have two important tools to control increase inequality.
I want to move to the end of your book, the last paragraph, because I think this segues, right? Because there's still that issue of the 1%, the elite, and the question of how global, where do these people belong? And I want to read your last paragraph, and then we can discuss it. And you say, quote, "We must also allow for the potential that the forces of globalization will create a global elite, and that the displacement of, say, some rich Americans by some rich Chinese from their top places in the global income distribution may not have much of a political effect on either between or within country inequality, because the global top layer may operate at a level apart from nation states. If we anticipate, as we should, that the current globalization will produce the first global elite, then social scientists must prepare to engage with new questions. What would the advent of such a global elite, or even a global middle class, if it were created, imply for international relations, for democracy, for corruption and taxation? These would be entirely new questions that the traditional social science, which has always taken the nation state as the unit at which most of the political and social competition and developments took place, did not study, nor envisage, or even imagine." End quote. I'm specifically interested in this concept of a global elite, and I wonder. And I understand where it's coming from. We think of this, a jet-setting class that, Russian oligarchs that live in Mayfair and London, and and take their yachts in the Mediterranean, or very wealthy Chinese who their families live in Vancouver, and they send their children to elite American universities, and they still have a national identity, but they're part of this global transnational elite. It's the Davos crowd, if you like. I'm curious, is that possible, though? I mean, is a global elite possible? Or is it just conjecture to get us thinking? Particularly in the context now when we think of maybe 5 years ago or even 10 years ago, I would have been more susceptible to that. But now with what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, the Xi Jinping tightening up China and going after those elites, maybe we're actually moving back to a period where the nation state is becoming important. But just reflect on that.
Well, that's what we were trying actually when I was saying before how hard it is actually to make not short-term predictions, but basically evolutionary social predictions. And we were, of course, linking that to Smith and Marx. And that's a very contemporary problem that we have now. And this issue that you mentioned fits perfectly. I like it. I like the quote. It's a good quote. I actually had in mind a broader group than the ones that you mentioned. Actually, I had in mind practically we are part of that.
Right.
This is a broader people who speak the same language, even as a lingua franca of English, who have quite a lot in common, intellectually, ideologically, who interact and so on. Yeah. So that's, I think, a broader group than only the oligarchs. Now, the question, of course, that one, let's go like 5 years ago, where actually I agree with you, the situation was different than it is today. You could argue that that group would have gradually, and it did have actually, and does have, much more in common among themselves than they might have with people with whom they share citizenship. Because the background is different, interests are different, and so on. But even if it were to happen, the question then becomes, let's suppose there is such a group, which has similar incomes and interests and so on. What does it politically mean? Because that group doesn't have a way to influence developments except through nation state. Because we don't have an overarching authority where they would exercise that influence. And we know historically it was always said that the middle class is good because there are lots of people with similar interests, similar incomes, and they don't want the top, the elite, to rule over them, nor do they want the bottom to take their assets. Right. So they're really a stable, cohesive force within nation state. But what would that group do globally? And that I find as a question mark, like how would they actually exert exercise their influence. So that was my sort of thinking, you see. And there I actually said, well, that is I thought a new issue for social scientists. Or for me, actually, I looked at global inequality, but there is no counterpart to the global inequality on the political side.
Right.
And that was my thinking. This would be a new issue that, as I said, I think some people could not even imagine because they really thought reasonably of all of these social classes, including Adam Smith, within societies. He thought a lot about interactions between societies, but not the formation of an supranational elite.
Right. No. I think. Okay. So this. Yeah. No. That actually. It's not how I read it, but that's actually. It's really interesting because I mean when you think about the global middle class, and I completely agree with you. I fit in that category. And just as an anecdote, I've taught in fairly international environments, and I've sat in classes which lots of international diversity, lots of international students, and I've noted students saying, "Wow, this is so amazing! Look how diverse we are." And I'd sit there and I'd say to them, well, okay, but actually, you might be European and you're from, even students from the global South, and I'd say, but sorry, but you're all middle class. You're all from the same. You're mostly cut from the same cloth. You might think you have some different life experiences, but more often than not, you find that those cohorts, they think the same, they have a sense of, their attachment to any sense of national identity is quite weak, or they think of themselves as cosmopolitan. And now you see, that kind of mobilization, at least in conservative politics in America, or even in Europe now with the globalists, right, which is being used as a pejorative. But I do wonder sometimes and this is perhaps a critique of other academics that I interact with, is sometimes I don't feel that there's an appreciation of their fellow country people.
I think that's the truth. Yeah, I mean, that's the argument was often made for the rise of Trump, or Le Pen, or AFD, and so on. So I think this is a legitimate question, as is, that was, I think, posed at the very end of the book. But I do agree with you that we have to think it again, because the current developments, which push towards a multipolar world, whatever it means exactly, do actually break this elite. On the other hand, let me just maybe finish with maybe somewhat of a pessimistic view. Even when you had a very strong elite on the eve of World War I in Europe, where not only were they an elite that actually spoke the same language, they were actually, as we know, all intermarried. And not only at the very top level, but even at lower levels. The number of people of aristocracy, who were married English and German, and the cultural influence between Germany and France was so strong. I was, by the way, rereading actually Proust, which he has in the last chapter of his long La Recherche, the World War I. And basically you see this intermixture of French aristocracy, who were half of them half German.
Right.
So you see that, and of course did not stop the war from happening.
Right.
So even the elite, even a sort of a pan-national elite is still not a guarantee against conflict.
Right. I mean, that's I think we look at, liberal internationalists look at globalization, and there's lots of universities in Europe are trying to instill the concept of global citizenship, and they're trying to, a better world is possible if we all come together and but that's the question, is that when conflict occurs, do those hundreds of thousands of Chinese middle-class students that have studied in the United States or Canada or across Europe or Australia, do they remember their experience and their kind of the time they had here, or do they recoil back to an allegiance to the nation state?
I think it is really a very good question. We have to think of this. I actually, since we are now on that topic, and since we are again in Adam Smith's home, you might remember that the quote that I chose for Adam Smith last time, which I think was an extremely interesting quote in this context. He saw the development of trade and consequently improvement in technology on both sides, which we can see now very clearly with China.
Right.
He saw that as equalizing mutual fear on the two sides and leading to peace. So it was actually in that context was a theory of peace, but not based on interdependence, not based on the elites being sort of intermixed, but based on essentially mutual fear, because technologically they were equal, and consequently neither side had anything to gain from war.
Right.
It's a very interesting thing in that sentence. It's actually, he comes with what you can call what is called today realistic, theory of international relations, not through the independence alone, but through same technological development. Right. And I find that quote very interesting, because in one long sentence, because it is really a long sentence, he actually covers like a theory of peace through trade, and also realistic theory of international relations.
Right. I mean, that's it's interesting when you see the, I guess, foreign policy vis-a-vis China from the West is that they're very concerned about China's technological development, and they want to retard that technological development because they see it having dual use.
Right.
It's an economic competition issue, but it's also a military issue, and so they don't want China to develop. And if you take Smith's view that you suggest, it's that, well, actually, no, we want China to develop because then China has much more to lose. And that's where I think some of the hawks, people that say that, no, Xi Jinping is not a madman because he doesn't want to lose out because, he has to, he wants China to succeed. And so I think that's an interesting perspective that we should keep in mind about Smith. And again, he looks at development in other countries as being, he has another quote where he talks about we should be excited about the development. I mean, he doesn't say it like that,
right.
But we should actually be happy with the development of other countries, other places.
Absolutely.
Because he saw prosperity as a general good, and that we shouldn't try to retard that development.
But he sees, I think he's extremely rich writer, and that attracted me to him. But as you mentioned, he sees, and he says, from, again, I am paraphrasing, but from the cosmopolitan point of view, we should be, he's talking as we as Scotsmen or Englishmen, we should be even more interested in prosperity of France because it's a bigger country than ours. And so consequently, more people would become prosperous. But he says a person who would hold that view would be considered a very poor patriot in England or Scotland.
Right.
So he immediately does, rightly, presents to you an issue. Like you are very much of a, everybody I think would be a cosmopolitan, how should I say, bent of mind, and would agree with his argument. But then he would also agree with his argument that he might not actually value prosperity in France on a per capita basis equally as he would value prosperity in his own or her own country. So Adam Smith, I think, is extremely rich in that it brings you both sides of the coin, and when you read it, you first agree with one and then you agree with the other too.
No, he was definitely a very rich writer. So I'm going to ask you one final question to round this up. What's next for Branko Milanovic? What's the next big project or view?
Well, my next project is a little bit what we discussed at the end now. It is the project of trying exactly to do what I was saying before, which is difficult, which was trying to figure out what could we say about the long-run developments given everything that we said before about China, Russia, US, artificial intelligence, geopolitical competition, similar elite. Is it possible to say something based on that reasonably, what one could expect the developments to be, however difficult it is? So that's the idea, and that's where I think China, in my opinion, does play a very important role. Obviously, the United States does, Russia possibly, because it could be a world of several poles, and Global South, which I believe now, with the role, particularly most recently, the role taken by, for example, South Africa and Brazil on a conflict which does not involve them, is, I think, maybe the first time that the Global South had a political voice, which is not, as I said, not on a conflict which is exactly, how should I say, their own.
Right.
So, that's my next project. But as you can see from a very sort of abstract way that I'm putting it, I'm not exactly sure how it would work. It does actually keep me, I have to say, sometimes awake at night.
Well, it's good to hear that we still have more of, we can expect more from Branko Milanovic, that there's more books to come. Well, thank you so much for being here in Adam Smith's house, being on our new podcast, The New Enlightenment.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's a pleasure, and it's a great title that you have for the project.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.